Hey folks, Nathan For You continues its new season on Comedy Central. Nathan Fielder is the comedian who brought you Dumb Starbucks and Pig Saves Goat, and he's back with more outlandish ideas to help real small businesses. This is his most ambitious season yet, people. You gotta see it to believe it. Nathan For You airs on Comedy Central Thursdays at 10, 9 Central, or anytime on the Comedy Central app. We're also sponsored by Chipotle. Life's full of mysteries, but you don't want any mysteries in your food. You don't want, say, like silicon dioxide hiding in your beans, which is what they do at some restaurants. Chipotle doesn't dioxide their beans, people. They gently simmer and season them with Chipotle chili, garlic, cumin, and oregano, then serve them with your choice of grilled adobo chicken, slow braised carnitas, or even organic tofu sofritas. Yeah, Chipotle, food without a side of questions. Huh? Yeah, that's right. All right, let's do the show.
Lock the gate!
All right, let's do this. How are you, what the fuckers, what the fuck buddies, what the fucksters, what the fuckineers? What's happening? It's Marc Maron. This is WTF, my podcast. Thank you for listening. Welcome. Welcome to the newcomers who are here for the Steve Albini episode. Interesting thing happened with the last episode. Aaron James Draplin from Draplin Design Company. It seems like there was a tremendous amount of momentum and feedback about that episode. There's something almost exciting to me about the idea that people may actually be getting sick of show business. Culturally, perhaps we're starting to get sick of the exhausting desperation of show business. Look, there's a lot of different versions of show business. I believe I'm operating in somewhat of a showbiz adjacent situation of my own making, and I'm happy with that. But after a certain point, there's an intensity to it all, to all the options, all the channels, all the streaming content, all of it coming at you all the time when you turn it on, moving billboards that actually seem to be large televisions in and of themselves. Just the constant sort of visual and mental crackling noise of, hey, over here. Yeah, that's sort of like the underlying pitch of all content now. Yo, hey, over here. Oh, look over here. That's really the undercurrent of all content, just about, and what goes into getting people to watch it. Hey, buddy, yo, over here, just watch this, just watch this for a minute, just watch it for a minute. Come on, just stay here for a minute. People liked hearing about a different medium, a different zone, a different mode, design. It was interesting to me, it was exciting to me to talk to a guy that pulled it together like that and creates things, and maybe that's a direction I got to go into a little more. I've always wanted to, but then I got to go out of the box. I got to go out of my box. Come on, look at this thing I made. I made a thing. It's so fucking, come on, just fucking look at it. Tonight on NBC. Come on, come on. Look, we did a thing. Come on, look. Tonight on ABC. Hey! Amazon. Hey, look at this thing I made wait a minute, CBS. Please look at this thing, Hulu. Come on, look. IFC. All of them. I don't think I'm being negative. I just think it's very difficult to hold people's attention, but I don't think you should necessarily play to that. Look, this is important. If you use the old WTF app for the premium archives, the app is going to be retired, done on November 1st. That's Monday. So make sure you switch your account to Howl Premium. Your plan and price will stay exactly the same, and you'll get everything you had on the old app. Plus all the exclusive content on Howl. Howl has sent you an email with transfer instructions. If you can't find the email or if you have questions, email support at howl.fm. That's support at howl.fm. Oh, hey, in the James Taylor episode, there was a gunshot at the end, and a lot of you seemed concerned, as you should be, when you hear a gunshot, either recorded or not. and you wanted some closure on that. There's been many people asking, did you ever find out what the gunshot was? Short answer, no, I did not. Did I investigate what it might be? I did not. Am I freaked out about it? Not really. Gunshots happen around here occasionally, and you just hope they're celebratory and not pointed at anybody. So I have no idea. It definitely sounded like a gunshot, but maybe it was someone's birthday. So no, I don't know, but everything's been cool since, okay? I hope that sates your concerns. All right. What else? Pow! I just shit my pants. JustCoffee.coop. Just threw that in. I don't do them as much as I used to. Look, it's coming. It's happening. It's happening. We're moving towards it. Today's Lorne clip is actually a pretty fascinating clip because it helped me out. It got me some closure through some honesty from Jim Brewer. This was episode 435 of this show of WTF, and he definitely seemed to have some info about my meeting with Lorne Michaels. He gave me just a little bit of clarity around that meeting with Lorne and why things might have turned out the way they did. Now, I assume a lot of you are up on the narrative. We're moving towards the Lorne Michaels episode that many of you who have listened to me for years know is a pretty important thing to me. Those of you who are just tuning in for the Albini, Steve Albini talk, I imagine you've fast-forwarded already. So this is me talking to Jim Brewer on episode 435 of this show.
You were up for SNL as the news guy.
Right.
And Lorne sat me down. And I swear to God, here's how it went. He goes, Jim, we're thinking about using Marc Maron as the update guy. Do you have thoughts on him? It's exactly what I said. I went, okay. I think he'll be the best news guy you've ever had in your life. I really said that.
Yeah.
I said, but you need to know a lot of people have problems with him. I go, he pisses people off, but that has nothing to do with me. And I said, if he's for the news guy, I think you got a home run.
Yeah.
I go, am I best friends with him? No. Do I love the guy? No. However, the guy would be a monster news anchor.
Oh my God.
I really feel that way, Lorne. And he's like, no, that's pretty much the feedback I get from everyone. I said, did you meet with him already? Now, I don't know if he said this or you said this. Something about monkeys. I feel like he told me this. He said to me, he said he met with you, and I said, well, how'd it go? And he said, well, he said everyone enjoys a monkey or something until they throw the feces at you. Or he said that.
No, I said that to him. He said, comedians are like monkeys.
Yes.
The monkeys make people laugh. And I said, unless they're throwing their shit at you.
Which when he
that
said...
stuck with him?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Come on, you fucking with me now?
No, I swear to God I'm not. I swear to God. And that made me really like you.
Come on!
I swear to God. And then...
I'm obsessed with that meeting, I mean, I talk about it all the fucking time. I'm obsessed with that meeting with Lorne.
He sat me down.
Mm-hmm.
And he asked me about you, and he asked me about Tracy Morgan.
Yeah, because we were there the same day.
And I said, Tracy is the most raw, funniest human beings I've ever met in my life off stage, Lorne. Mm-hmm. I don't think I've ever laughed so hard just
off stage.
I said, I just listen to him rant, and I just find myself, I feel like I'm looking at a Richard Pryor, but it's raw.
Yeah.
It's on stage is a different beast.
Right.
Off stage, I've never seen anything more fascinating in my life. And he goes, now, Mark, what about Marc Maron? for the update. And I really...
God, so he was really thinking about it. Because I thought,
yeah.
Because I thought, like, in retrospect, that he might have been, trying to muscle Norm into something or whatever. But because I didn't get it, obviously.
They were done with Norm, yeah.
They were done.
They were done.
Yeah. See, now look, I can deal with that explanation. At least there was a reason. I never would have thought Jim Brewer would be the key to unlocking the mystery, but there you go. The number of Lorne Michaels conversations I've had on this show is astounding. Look, if you love books but never have the time to read them, I've got the perfect solution. At Audible.com, you can get audiobooks and listen to the ones you've been meaning to read wherever you want. At the gym, during your commute, in the shower, anywhere. Audible.com has more than 180,000 audio programs, and their free app works on iPhones, iPad, Android, Windows Phone, Kindle Fire, and over 500 MP3 players. Audible.com also has the great listen guarantee. If you decide you don't like the book you choose, no worries, no problem. You can exchange any book you aren't happy with for another title anytime, no questions asked. So let's go to Audible. We've got Steve Albini today, so let's throw in Nirvana. Nirvana, Kurt Cobain, a Rock View autobiography by Pete Bruin. Nirvana in Utero, a 33 1/3 series. I like that series. Heavier Than Heaven, a biography of Kurt Cobain, narrated by Lloyd James. Cinema Nirvana, Enlightenment Lessons from the Movies. Boy, we got 3 of the band, and then we're right into... The point is, there's a lot of stuff, all right? And Audible.com is offering a free audiobook of your choice and a free 30-day trial membership. Go to audiblepodcast.com/WTF to start your free trial today. Again, show your support for WTF and get a free audiobook and 30-day trial at audiblepodcast.com/WTF. Dig it. All right, Steve Albini. Coming up. How do I preface Albini? Steve Albini is one of these guys. He's a legend. He's a living myth in the rock and roll arena. He's a producer that is wary of calling himself a producer. He's a guitar player. He's a fixture in the world of an important gear in the machinery of modern music, in my mind. Though a very humble gentleman, intense. And I know a lot of you who are deep music nerds have, very specific expectations around what you want to hear from Albini. I had a good conversation with him. And obviously some of the records that he made, were profoundly important in my life. Pixies, Nirvana, The Breeders. There's hundreds of records. Hell of a resume, this guy. But one of the most important things to me, when I was in college, I can't even put a date on this, but it's got to be the mid-'80s, and I'm thinking he's probably in Big Black. Maybe, I don't know. But I know that I went to see Steve Albini at the Rathskeller in Boston, Massachusetts, in Kenmore Square. I was going to BU. I'm thinking it's got to be 84 maybe, 83, 84. I don't remember being with anybody. I remember going down there, drinking. I was probably with somebody. I remember Steve Albini standing in the middle of that little stage. You go down in the basement. You walk past Mitch at the door with his weird gray toupee and his voice box. He had a voice box. He's a large man. You just read a story into that guy. He always had a suit on. Looked like he might have been a little connected, but he had the voice box. How you doing? Check your ID. And then down in the basement was where the Rat was, the real rock and roll club. Low ceilings, fucking dirty. The Rathskeller, gone. So I go to see Albini, and I remember him just playing that fucking massive, guitar sound. But the most important thing about that night in my mind, and I believe it was that night, things get a little blurry, As you get older, you realize you're just a curator of misperceptions and altered memories. But I went to that Steve Albini show, and then in the crowd, moving through the crowd, was this woman. But I didn't see her at first. All I saw was this fantastic black mohawk. And then as I followed the black mohawk down, the shaved sides, I saw this intense, round, angry face, and this stout kind of little tank, down to the docks, to the Doc Martens and the black jeans, and I was like, holy fuck, who is that? And it's not, I don't know that I had any game then, or certainly I had any real sort of couth. I always moved through the world with the same type of intensity I have now, only younger, which was probably even more disconcerting. And I just went up to her and I'm like, who are you? What? And her name was Lorne. And I fell in love with her almost like immediately at that Steve Albini show. I'm going to put it on that show. And I just remember we walk home and she's kicking cans and, just like this angry little art woman, girl at the time. She was going to mass art. She was telling me stories about her ex, like maybe her ex or current boyfriend, I don't know, who worked in, sort of large, soft sculptures. And they'd, maybe she had some story about living out in the country in a trailer. Devious and weird. She was from New Jersey and just full of this angry intensity. But she was a welder. And I've told the story about, going to her house that first time. Just completely enamored with her. And she had a sculpture that she had done in metal. Just emaciated metal female figure. And the vagina was just full of nails. And I was like, yeah, all right, I can handle this. Loved her. Still love her. See her sometimes. Still doing the art. But, has a life with a man. We all get old and hopefully level off. But, man, that night, that Steve Albini concert, just seeing that black mohawk kind of cut through the crowd like the fin of a shark. Like, what? Who's connected to that? She changed my life. So now, let's go and talk to Steve Albini. You want to work cans?
Sure. Cans. I love those studio terms.
Cans. Do you call them cans?
No, no one calls them cans.
No one does?
No, of course not.
Come on.
No one says take 5 either. Nobody says that.
Come on, radio guys say cans.
Well, okay. The music guys don't.
All right. Well, okay. All right. I learned something. What do they call them? Headphones?
Exactly, yeah.
All right.
In many, I've learned how to, just by being a recording engineer,
yeah.
I've learned a few useful studio expressions in many languages.
Yeah. Like what?
In Dutch, for example,
yeah.
Zet je koptelefoon op.
Yeah.
Which means put your headphones on.
Uh-huh.
Koptelefoon.
Okay.
That's kop is head, and these are koptelefoon.
And you learned that from recording Dutch guys.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you remember what Dutch guys?
I think it was the Dutch heavy metal band Gore.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Is there a possibility, I got to ask you a couple questions right up front. Would you have been touring, I met a girl in college who was very important to me, and I met her at the Rat in Boston.
Played there many times.
As yourself, though? Like, would you have been touring as Steve Albini in, say, 84, 85?
No.
Big Black?
In 85, I would have been in Big Black.
So was you, because I remember I was at a Steve Albini show, and I met this chick with a black mohawk, and, and the rest is history. Man.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. Yeah, so you remember that, huh?
I don't know. I don't remember the chick with the black mohawk.
Come on, you got it. We were both standing there. No?
The Rat was a shithole. I don't know. I mean, it kind of typified the era of like punk venues where there were sort of two kinds of punk venues.
Yeah.
There were places that were sort of the community where you had guys that were in punk bands that like coerced a bar owner into letting them have a night, and then they sort of developed into
a thing.
Yeah. And it gathered momentum, and you had clubs where the punk bands were welcome,
right?
Because the people that were running the scene were and then the other thing was that you had the shittiest bar in town where you could get away with stuff.
Yeah.
And so the shittiest bar in town ended up being a punk club.
Like the Basement.
Yeah.
Like the Rat.
Like the Rat, for example. I mean, pretty good example. The dude that ran it had one
Mitch.
Had one of those.
Yeah. And the big hair, the toupee. I think his name was Mitch.
Yeah. And it would routinely just decide not to pay the band.
Is that true?
Yeah. And he'd go into his office and he'd click the little buzzer on his throat and he'd be like, "There's no way you're getting the money." And they had the bouncers. There was a weight room upstairs where the bouncers would all be like working out. So you'd have these yard wide meatheads, standing on either side of him while he's like sitting at this, the sort of melted elephant of a dude sitting behind his desk. And he's like, the show didn't do well. There's no way you're getting the money.
That is, and then you just have to walk.
Well, yeah. I mean, what else are you going to do?
What are you going to do with that guy?
Like he'd say, he would offer you some pittance, like I'm losing money, but I'll give you gas money. That sort of thing.
God.
It was like kind of a routine scenario that never happened to us
because you guys were popular.
Not so much that. I think it was kind of the luck of the draw. Like even in the 80s, you could figure out how to schedule a tour so that you would hit a town on a night when people would be willing to go out, and so we structured our tours in a way where you would play the bigger towns on the better nights, and then the crappier towns you'd play midweek. And because a punk audience in a crappy town is going to go out any night of the week that a band comes through because they're ecstatic that someone's bothered.
Right. They're here. Yeah. They're in our town.
So you could play, a fat spot in the road in Kansas or Indiana on a Tuesday or Wednesday, and you could expect a sort of normal crowd. Whereas if you're playing in Friday or playing in Chicago, people have a lot of other options for their entertainment dollar.
It's kind of wild though, man. That whole even all the cities that were music cities, all that scene is just sort of gone, isn't it?
Not at all.
No?
I mean, it's
like you go to Boston and the entire Kenmore Square is leveled.
Okay, well, Boston is a special case. There was a monopolistic control of live music venues. What was the name of the company? Don Law, was that the name of the company?
Don Law, yeah.
Yeah, they have monopolistic control of music venues.
Even the small ones?
Basically every suitable room. I mean, it's the same sort of thing that happened on a national scale with
Clear Channel,
Live Nation, sort of taking over venues and just exerting
the airwaves.
Or it can just be like a closed society of club owners and music people that won't allow anybody else, any independent people to operate.
You hear a noise?
I do.
What is it?
Is it in the world or in your mic? Leaf blower. You've got leaf blower noise.
Yeah.
They have a filter for that.
Hey, Dennis! It just happened spontaneously. Oh, now he's blowing out his fountain. Oh, shit. Hey, Dennis! Dennis! He's the guy that suggested I put an on-the-air light on the side of my garage.
This will be my favorite part of the broadcast, for sure.
Hey, Dennis! Dennis, can I interview for like an hour? No, I'm sorry, dude. I did. I'm just doing another one. I'll be done in like an hour. Then I'll come do it if you want. So is this punk rock enough?
Sure.
Fuck. So, did you come from around here?
Well, in a circuitous way. My folks came from California. My dad went to Caltech, and when he finished his graduate work at Caltech, he started having kids. We lived in Pasadena.
It's right down the street.
But I was the last kid, and very shortly after I was born, I think I was less than a year old, we moved to Washington, D.C., so I remember nothing.
Right. How many kids are there?
I have a brother, Marty, who's 2 years older.
Yeah.
A sister, Mona, who's 1 year older, and that's it.
Oh, 3.
And then we moved to Washington, D.C., and then in the mid-1960s, we moved back to Santa Barbara, and I remember some about Santa Barbara. I was there I was maybe 6, 7, 8 years old, something like that. And then 4, 5, and 6, something like that. I remember some of that.
Right.
And then we moved back to Washington, D.C. area. And my dad worked as an engineer in aeronautics and doing some Defense Department contracting.
So the secret work? Did you get that? Like I can't talk about...
Well, he didn't bring his work home.
Right.
But some of it was literal secrets. Like he worked on the Titan 3C missile, and he worked on...
No shit.
Yeah, he worked on a bunch of stuff for the Star Wars bullshit.
Really? Did he talk to you about that later?
He couldn't really... He couldn't really... Well, he's dead now, but he couldn't really talk about it like specifically.
Yeah.
But the thing that was odd about my father was that he was an engineer. He was a brilliant engineer, and the thing that gave him the most satisfaction in life was solving the hardest problem. So he wanted the hardest problem, and he was eager to have the hardest right. So, and the thing about the whole Star Wars technology was that is essentially impossible, like to do what was being postulated as easy and as like the saving grace.
That was the shield in space with the satellites.
It was shooting a bullet with a bullet, like that whole
shooting down the missile.
Yeah, right. That whole concept. Was essentially impossible.
Right.
But and as a result, it was like the hardest problem.
Right.
So my dad was like super eager to work on it. Right. So he was spending all of his energy in this this ultimately like completely futile effort. But it was very satisfying for him to be like, well, that's going to be really difficult.
Right.
That's probably going to tie me up for weeks and then be in bliss, you know?
Yeah.
But toward the end of his life, he worked for the Department of the Interior, working on the science of forest fires, which is impossibly complex, but in a very practical way, you can make pretty significant improvements in the way we treat the forest and the way we treat fire.
But not specifically about fighting them necessarily?
No, managing the resource of the forest so that people can use it, and then it also doesn't become a threat to itself.
Right.
I mean, there was a long history of preventing forest fires at all cost. That was like a sort of policy, and that was
Smokey the Bear.
Absolutely disastrous, because fires are part of the life cycle of a forest.
Right.
And then mitigating the damage done by these catastrophic fires that were started because we had allowed so much fuel to build up by putting out all the fires all the time.
Yeah.
Like that became a part of the problem. And then just understanding the behavior of fire itself is where my father concentrated his efforts. And he was a renowned scientist in that regard. Very young science. There's still so much. We know way less about fire than we thought we did.
Really,
from the efforts of the people at the Northern Forest Fire Research Laboratory.
Yeah, well, I know that once it starts, you just got to wait it out sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, it's the thing that I like about my father's work in forest fire is that he took this incredibly complex problem and created practical tools that people in the field they could enter a few variables into a portable calculator, for example. Yeah. And using a program that was a reduction of all of this complex theory. Yeah. And then they could figure out how far ahead they had to go before they dug the fire line. Like that sort of like very practical, very, like, oh, well, that house is doomed. Let's move on. Things like that.
Right. Yeah. Make those big decisions. Yeah. We're going to lose that one. What is your training exactly?
I left, working in the forest fire working with forest fires brought our family to Montana, and I did my principal growing up in Missoula, Montana.
I have no idea what that even looks like.
It's beautiful. It's like if you picture like God's plan for the earth, right?
Oh, really?
Mountains and trees and like rolling grass and rivers and massive lakes and beautiful snow caps. Like Montana has all of that. Like there's
beautiful
high desert. There's lush coniferous forest.
You love Montana.
I mean, when I was there,
sure,
I was into punk rock, and it seemed like extraordinarily frustrating to be in a place that has it's really its only characteristic is the people and the natural beauty. And what I wanted like dope fiends and hustlers and
where's the good stuff? Where are the freaks at?
So I left to come to Chicago to go to school in 1980, and
you left Missoula.
I've been in Chicago ever since.
You went to high school in Missoula.
You went to high school in Missoula. I went to college in Chicago at Northwestern University
and studied what?
Journalism.
So you're in Missoula, and what was the moment where you knew there was something bigger and more exciting out there?
It's weird because I've had to recall this moment for interviews.
Oh, yeah?
So it's now become crystalline in my memory.
Well, then let's go to a week or so before it.
Well, like my circle of friends and I in high school, we were all like, dorks into like horror movies and,
So you were with the nerd crew.
Yeah.
Anti-jock.
Super dorks, in the school newspaper, sarcastic
Were you bullied?
assholes. I mean, I was hated. I wasn't physically attacked very often.
Hated for what reason?
I was kind of a loudmouth.
Yeah,
which is, I mean, that's, you know.
So you were an aggressive nerd.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
I mean, I've recognized that as a character flaw, and I've done what I can to sort of ameliorate it.
Really? The anger?
No. The
being an asshole.
Like, just feeling like it was really important that everybody in the room knew what I was thinking all the time, right? Like I got that out of my system when I was in high school. And
did you have to get beat up for it?
No, although when I was in college, I was still drinking when I was in college, and I got into this thing where I really enjoyed taunting the fraternity people and the fraternity system.
Sure.
I drew cartoons for the school newspaper, you know, ridiculing and insulting it.
Yeah.
But they threw fantastic parties where bands would play and the booze was free and women would appear.
Yeah.
You know. So everyone exploited the fraternities as a kind of a social resource, right? You would go to the parties.
You'd be like, we'll go to the frat house, but if just the five of us go, you're insulated in your crew of friends amongst the idiots. Yeah.
I would go typically with a friend of mine named John Bonin, and I would go to these parties, and we would be like the two weirdos in the funny clothing. And I can't remember what the precipitating incident was, whether I published some cartoon mocking the fraternity system or something. But my friend John and I were at one of these frat parties, and we were taking advantage of all the free beer and music and women and that sort of thing. And a kind of a ripple went through all the Greek douchebags, you know, like, oh, that Albini guy is here, you know, right?
The dude
and then
did the thing.
They sort of started to congregate around the two of us, and I don't know how I did it, and it's like probably the only moment of judo in my entire life, but I managed to extricate myself from this closing circle of Greeks, and then all of us threw my friend John out of the party as me. And I stood with the mob on the balcony shaking my fist at that Albini guy that we had just thrown out of the party. So that's like the only clever thing I've ever done in my life.
Was everybody okay? Did John make it out all right?
Yeah, it was fine.
It was an interesting, almost... not cowardly, but, you know...
absolutely cowardly. Yeah, absolutely. I mean...
Let John take the hit.
And, he forgave me. He understood the situation perfectly.
But they were too fucking stupid to know the difference.
Exactly. I mean, they just wanted, it's typical, like, right-wing mob mentality. They just want someone to take the blame instantly, and then they can forget about whatever the underlying issue is. They can just move on.
Isn't it interesting how you see that stuff, like, in retrospect, now that we're older, you see that it's all set up at such a young age that the fraternity system is designed to create a brotherhood of douchebags that will take care of each other throughout life.
And whether it's those specific douchebags, it's that whole. It doesn't matter that we're wrong; we're together. That mentality and
we can win.
And like you hear, that you hear that in sort of corporate motivational speech and all that sort of stuff. You hear that same sort of like group identity nonsense. And it's all typically being fostered by an authority figure, like from above. Like, all of you people who work for me need to see yourselves as a team.
Exactly. So, all right, so you're there, you're in Missoula. You're just like, what kind of music are you listening to before the Enlightenment?
I wasn't really...
Not at all?
I wasn't significantly interested in music until I discovered the Ramones. The Ramones were a touchstone for me.
Right.
My brother had left for college, and he left behind his collection of records, which were typical hard rock records of the era. Alice Cooper, The Who.
You like that, though, right?
Yeah. I mean, that was formative for me. Listening to that stuff was formative to me.
Yeah.
I mean, my sister had like schlock records. I mean, not a patch on my sister. I think she's a wonderful woman and she's very intelligent.
Like Elton John.
Yeah, good example. Like Gordon Lightfoot. A lot of
The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald or previous.
Now, and all of that stuff has its charm.
Sure.
But, when you compare Gordon Lightfoot to Alice Cooper, Gordo gets a bloody nose.
That's right. It's a hell of a chasm there.
Yeah. So,
how old are you?
I'm 52. I'll be 53 in a couple of days.
So we're the same fucking age. I'm 51. So we grew up. And even when we were growing up with that stuff, it was already kind of old when we were in high school. Most of it. Yeah. That's the weird thing. I can't really, I think when we were in high school, so you're a year ahead of me, we saw the death of disco happen. We saw it. And then we saw new wave happen. And then punk just sort of got left out for where I was.
The thing that seems strange to me is like if you look at if you just look at a timeline, like from Woodstock to the CBGB era, was only like 6 or 7 years.
Holy shit,
like it's kind of incredible.
That's true.
I
never really thought about that.
And then if you think about like from Bill Haley to Woodstock is only
11
like
years?
10, 11 years.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And I've been flogging the same bullshit for 30 years now, and I feel like I still feel contemporary, which is absurd, and it should be impossible.
No, it's not. No, I don't. I'm not gonna. It's not flogging the same bullshit. At some point, but it is always peculiar to me to realize that rock and roll in earnest. It's like 1957
somewhere in
or
there,
so, right? Rock Around the Clock or Rocket 88, whichever one you attribute the beginning to. And it's still so fucking young. Like I never really put it together like that. How much it just sort of blew up over time.
The aggressiveness of evolution in the early stages of rock, from late 50s, you've got skiffle in the UK and like rock and roll and rockabilly stuff in America. Then mid 60s, you have the British explosion, then immediately followed by like the pop music side of that, like sort of melded in or dissolved into the psychedelic period where you had like radical stuff happening. Yeah. Going into the 70s where you had like the prog stuff, which is also radical. A lot of it, preposterous, but a lot of it still very adventurous.
Are you into it?
No, not specifically, but I can recognize that there are fringe elements of prog rock that I find fascinating, like the krautrock stuff.
Oh yeah.
Like Can and Tangerine Dream, and Kraftwerk, and all that stuff. All of that stuff is an organic.
Crimson, no Crimson.
Yeah, it has its moments. Right? And just the other day, we were listening to. I don't know how it happened, but Bob's iPod was on shuffle in the van. And we played Roundabout by Yes.
Yeah.
Right?
And around. Right. I wait for that part.
That song by itself is essentially the entire career of the band Rush condensed, and executed to perfection. Like it made Rush unnecessary.
Yeah.
Really.
They were kind of unnecessary.
Yeah. So, that's
a band conversation.
But that's a very small number in physical time.
But were you excited when you guys came up with that in the van? When you?
Oh yeah.
That's like
we have a couple of van music rules.
Yeah.
One of them is that if a song starts with cowbell, you turn it up.
Yeah.
Because the number of great songs that start with a cowbell is extraordinary. Like the batting average for starting with a cowbell. It's like a very good signifier.
We're an American band.
Right?
Honky Tonk Women.
Right? Mississippi Queen. Like basically it's really, really hard to miss if the song starts with a cowbell. And we got fooled once. We were in Europe. I don't know if you've ever listened to European popular radio, but like they play music, a very weird pastiche of music. So this is in the, in the 2000s something.
Yeah.
We hear cowbell. Song starts with cowbell. Yeah. Fucking turn it up, right?
Yeah.
So and it ended up being Loverboy, Everybody's Working for the Weekend. Like such a downer to like
slipped in.
You're so excited. And then we realized that the paradigm had not actually been broken.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't a real cowbell. It was the metronome. The metronome. They were using a metronome cowbell drum machine.
Okay.
And they just left it in. So we're still safe.
So you just how much research did you have to figure that out?
It became apparent over the course of the song. Like, that song is so bad it must have been done to a metronome. That cowbell isn't really a cowbell. We're off the hook,
Well, when you get your mind blown coming back around. So we actually did it coming back around to the moment where you got the Ramones record.
Right.
Well, you had an older brother, which thank God, right?
Yeah. I mean,
the records are important.
Yeah.
Where did the Ramones album come from?
A friend of mine or an acquaintance of mine on the school bus had a cassette tape in one of those little portable accordion button cassette players.
Panasonic.
I don't know.
With the buttons at the end.
Exactly. Little accordion buttons on the end.
Yeah.
And he had a Ramones tape in it, and we were listening to it on the bus, and we were laughing our asses off. It was like the most hilarious thing we'd ever heard. This inept bubblegum music just played super ferociously. What a perfect comedy that was for us. We were mocking everything, and this was a thing that mocked everything and itself.
Right.
So it really resonated with me, and I ordered my own copy of the record from the record store, and then when it came, I played it obsessively. And it was comic.
Right.
You know, at first I was like laughing at the ineptitude and and then somewhere around the 10th or 12th iteration of playing that record obsessively, I realized that it was actually perfect and the greatest record ever made.
The first Ramones record.
Yeah. And from that point on, like, I saw the world differently.
Well, what changed? What perfect in what way in your mind?
It sounds kind of high-minded to attach all of this stuff to a band or a record.
Why not?
But
yeah, that's what we do here. It's our job.
The Ramones, the subject matter of the Ramones music was all the same sort of childish shit that my friends and I were talking about.
Right.
You know, like, you know, outsider culture, trash popular culture. You know, horror movies. Comics, like. Stupid childish shit that we had clung to and that we were still that we had kind of imbued with this significance in our peer group, right? And the Ramones were taking that stuff seriously. So then suddenly I thought, well, maybe I can take these perverse notions that roll through my mind seriously. Like, if they're singing songs about, you know, a chainsaw massacre or about, you know, sucking dick for drug money or whatever, like whatever they're singing about, like, I mean, that's legit then. Like, I can entertain those thoughts in my own head. I don't have to suppress them. I don't have to, like, not consider those part of my useful vocabulary, right? So it made me take my own musings and ramblings seriously. And then, by extension, I had to take seriously other people's insane obsessions and musings and ramblings. It made me take other people different from myself, people who didn't fit the paradigm of, like, sort of
mainstream
serious people, and in all aspects of my life. I'm not joking when I say that it changed the way I thought about the entire world.
Right, it gave you almost an aesthetic, in a sense, or an understanding,
and a social awareness. Like, you know, it had never occurred to me that somebody would have to suck dick for drug money. Like, it never occurred to me and then I realized, oh yeah, I guess under a certain set of circumstances that becomes a viable option, and also maybe a career, you know? Okay.
How old were you?
Like 14, you know?
This is important shit.
Yeah.
Like, I think I got this, it's weird because I'm thinking about something in my own life. It would have been like National Lampoon or something.
Yeah,
like
and that was also, like, that was also part of my peer group. Like, we were all really into National Lampoon.
Right.
And, you know, it served the same sort of cultural purpose that Mad Magazine did in the late 50s, early 60s, you know.
Right.
And, you know, by taking all of these offshoots of lefty or free-thinking culture seriously, like, it genuinely forced me to reassess my interactions with every other person. Like, I tried not to be as instantly judgmental in some instances, but in some instances I was much more judgmental, like immediately dismissive of people who seemed square and hidebound and
douchebags.
Yeah, or you know, just frozen into a pre-existing paradigm.
Right.
Like, those people seemed like suckers to me.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. And frightened suckers in a way. Like, just but that's the weird thing about, because I imagine, you know, having been in music and recorded as much as you've had and experienced people, that either some of those meatheads get their minds blown. Yeah. It might happen later.
Right.
But they're not all hopeless.
No.
You know?
And, you know, and I think, I shudder to think what my life trajectory would have been had that moment on that school bus not transpired. Like, what would have happened to give me that kind of a, you know, while I was in a malleable state, you know, when you're a young teenager and you're forming your own personality, like, what other thing might I have latched onto that could have, you know,
well, it seemed like
put
you
me
were
on a different trajectory.
Well, it might have been chess. Like, it did sound like you were going to be like a football player or anything.
But, you know, for example, like my politics could have gotten radicalized. Like, you know, I could have ended up a libertarian douchebag. I could have, I mean, there are a lot of things.
There's still time, man.
Yeah.
For that one.
Like, a lot of things could have happened.
Right.
To give me an angle, a prism through which I would see the rest of my life. And it happened to be the Ramones. I'm incredibly lucky that it was the Ramones.
Right.
And underground culture. Yeah. Rather than, you know, the Young Republicans or something. You know?
Right, but it sounds to me like you were already a disruptive force, and that you already had an innate suspicion of hierarchy of power and that kind of stuff.
Right, but I think all of that energy and all of that intellect, like any of that could have been directed in a different way.
Right. All it would have taken was one strong-minded douchebag guy that you looked up to, and then you're off.
It's like Bill Hicks said, you know, the wrong friends and the wrong bar, and anybody can be a bum. You know?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and the right timing.
Yeah.
So, all right, so you have this moment, but you're not a musician at that time.
No. And then in my little peer group, we decided to start a band, and we started a band, and
no one knew how to play anything?
Not really. I mean, we had a...
What'd you play?
I played bass at that point, and because I had fewer strings than guitar, it seemed like it would be easier.
Yeah.
And it was. I mean, legitimately, that's a...
And you just taught yourself bass?
I had 2 lessons from an instructor that was recommended by the guitar store where I bought the bass.
Right.
And he was also the cheapest instructor in town.
Uh-huh.
And the first lesson, he taught me how to tune the bass. Like, he showed me, like, physically how to tune the bass and what tuning it involved. And then the second lesson, he started to teach me the difference between a minor scale and a major scale. And at that point, I realized that I had learned enough.
Yeah, sure. So what was that band?
That was a band called Just Ducky. And coincidentally, I ran into the woman who was the singer for that band, or a singer for that band, on this tour. She lives in Portland. Her name is Heather Goncher. She's a structural engineer.
Oh, really?
She builds bridges and stuff.
Wow. So she got out.
Yeah. She got out unscathed. And everybody that was the thing that's cool that has transpired again and again in my life is I'll run into people that I thought were like smart and on the ball when they were like 15 years old or whatever, or 18 years old or 20 years old, or whatever. I'll run into them 20 or 30 years later, and they're still smart and on the ball, and I still admire them, and I still think they're cool. Yeah.
And maybe you haven't talked to them in 20 years?
Yeah, and it's amazing how, I mean, I think it's true more for dudes than for women, but like a friendship that a guy has with another guy, that friendship just reinflates and becomes whole after a span of like 20 or 30 years. No problem. Like you're right back where you were. You know?
I think that's true. There are guys that I know in my life that, and I'm not gender specific, but I mean they're mostly dudes that I know in my life where you just know it's not shakeable. Like there's no like that. You know, a couple of people that get lost, drugs, religion, or something. But a lot of times they come out the other side.
Even there, like under the veneer of what they've applied, it's the same dude.
Same dude. Yeah, holding on, trying to get through. So at what point do you just break it open? Once you got the Ramones records, you start just amassing records.
Yeah, I mean, I was lucky in that Missoula is a college town.
Yeah.
So in college towns, people like bring stuff with them from wherever they came, and then when they leave or when they need like weed money or whatever, they like shed that stuff to the secondhand market.
Right.
So there were very good secondhand record stores in Missoula. There's one of the great record stores in the world, this place called Rockin' Rudy's in Missoula. And that place, that place came into full flower after I left, but it is one of the great record stores. You can, it's an emporium. But while I was there were still a bunch of secondhand record shops. There was sort of hybrids. Missoula had a lot of weird hybrid culture. Like there was one shop that had secondhand records, secondhand motorcycles.
Yeah.
Guitars and home wine and beer making equipment. Like that was this one shop.
It's like creative off the grid stuff that you need. But at that time, I've talked to other cats who were in the original kind of American punk movement that it was really driven by a network of fans and people that needed literally to mail each other sometimes.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And the whole zine culture and like to get actual punk records was sort of a chore.
Yeah, and there was if you ran into somebody else who had cool music taste, like the first topic would be, what are the cool records? And then they would start to, there was kind of like this underground education that you would pick up, like, oh yeah, this record, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
Like you'd go into a record store and the guy behind the counter would recognize you from, and it was from where you were looking and what you looked like.
Right.
He would say, "Have you heard this?"
Right.
And he'd, like pull out a record.
You're always getting your mind blown, like once a week.
It was terrific. And that you said earlier that sort of network it doesn't exist anymore. That the live music scene and the fan network doesn't really exist anymore. I disagree wholeheartedly. It's just...
It was lighthearted. I'm not going to argue with it.
It's just moved venues to the internet.
Yeah.
And now there are these very robust online communities and exchange, available, which has made for the exact same kind of interaction, just in in a non-physical environment, and so you still, like, you find a website that's about a band that you never heard about before, and in that website there are links to a bunch of other sort of progenitor bands that are all interesting.
I guess what I should have said is I'm old.
You can't play that shit with me.
I guess I can't.
Yeah.
Well, I know that's true, but is there something that's lost in it not being physical?
Yes.
Like it used to?
The culture, the personal culture of the record store, I still value pretty highly. I don't go into record stores nearly as much as I used to, and that's on me.
So when you started playing, your drive was just to be a punk rock guy, to be a musician.
Yeah, I just wanted to. I wanted to participate in this mania that was evident from the records that I was buying and from the, I wanted to participate in it.
But you didn't find it in Missoula. You had to wait till you went to college.
I mean, we enjoyed ourselves in the band that we had in Missoula, but it couldn't be described in any way other than failure. So I think we played 2 gigs.
That was it?
Yeah. And one of them,
short life.
We played at a high school.
Yeah.
A high school booked us for a dance or something.
Yeah.
Someone at the high school booked us.
Right.
And midway through our show, like maybe 30 minutes into the show, the chaperone for the day, like the assistant principal or whatever, marched onto the stage,
yeah,
and presented our singer with the check for our fee and said, "You guys can stop and leave." And so we were actually cut off mid-set. At one of our only gigs.
That sounds like a successful punk performance. It sounds like it did exactly what it was supposed to do.
And even then,
it shook them up. Do you remember what song might have been the one that pushed them over the edge?
I know that we did a cover of the Cramps song "Human Fly," and I think it was during the "Human Fly" that our singer was interrupted. But we were thinking 2 steps ahead.
Yeah,
we cashed the check at a Safeway on the way out of town so that they wouldn't have time to stop payment on it.
Oh, you think they would have?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Why else would they do it?
Right, just to get him out.
Yeah.
Get them out.
Get him out the door.
So when you got to college, you were playing music and you were just going to school?
I was going to school. I was playing music.
Why journalism exactly?
I had a kind of a romantic notion of journalism from being, in the high school newspaper and sort of idolizing. And it was a time when, like, Woodward and Bernstein had sort of made an enormous political contribution.
So you were like 14 in 76 or 75. Yeah.
So, like, it seemed as though journalism could be, a tool of change, and it seemed as though journalism could be important. And it seemed, just on a fundamental level, I thought writing down what happens now is important for the future.
Right.
Yeah. And that just seemed like a noble thing. And my heroes at the time were, journalists, muckrakers, and, people who had an effect on the culture, on the greater culture.
And the Ramones.
And the Ramones.
Right.
So, I did, in fact, pick a school that was in a big city where I assumed that there would be a vibrant punk rock scene, because I could have gone to Columbia in Missouri, which is another good journalism school.
Right.
But I didn't think there would be as much punk rock there, so I chose Northwestern, which is right next to Chicago, because I was certain there would be a lot of punk rock in Chicago.
Was there?
Yeah, there was a very interesting, small, but extraordinarily energetic punk scene.
So you were just a kid hanging around?
Yeah, I was just going to shows. I mean, I tried to put together bands on my own, and I was kind of not doing well at that, and I joined another band, and I got kicked out of that band, and then I started recording on my own.
Why'd you get kicked out?
I kept making fun of Brian Ferry. I think that was the last straw. There was a couple that was at the core of the band, and they were really into...
A couple? They were Roxy Music fans?
They were really into, like, that kind of British, like, sort of...
romantic...
high forehead kind of music.
And sports jackets. And you were just relentless.
Yeah.
Fuck Brian Ferry.
Basically. I mean... Again, as I've matured, I now see the charms in some of that stuff. But at the time, it just seemed really phony and pretentious, and I didn't want anything to do with it. Anyway, I got kicked out of that band. I started recording stuff on my own as Big Black, and that's when I actually started to get involved on a more like significant level in the music scene.
In terms of recording and playing,
and also playing out. Like, we formed a live band. Jeff Pizzotti, the singer from Naked Ray Gun, who at the time was one of my absolute heroes. That band was an earth-shaking band to me. Seeing Naked Ray Gun perform in the early 80s was just every show was completely radically different. Like they did one show where they were all tripping balls, and the music was just like a sheet of noise, and then they would do another show where it was kind of like this weird space rockabilly. And then they did one show where the 4 members of the band set up on little platforms in different corners of the room. So they were sort of playing, like there's this confused crowd of like maybe 40 or 50 people in the middle of the room, like nobody knew where to look.
But that was exciting because, experimental music at that time, like, because I remember in Albuquerque where I grew up, I talked about it before, I knew this guy who had this band that played twice a year called Jungle Red, and it was just 2 of them, and there were, doll parts and noise, and it was something. They were both wearing jumpsuits.
It seemed like such an open field at the time. It seemed like limitless. And that to me was stimulating and exciting, and that like sort of embodied this mentality that I had. Like, what I imagined the Ramones meant by all of their stuff seemed to be physically embodied by the bands and the culture that I saw in the punk scene in Chicago. And it validated my thinking. It validated all these leaps of logic that I had made about how I should live and how I should think about people. Like, when you're in the company of people, like, I came from Missoula, Montana, and I was not particularly, like, socially aware. And suddenly I was in the company of immigrants and queers and dope fiends and people that literally lived on the street, and like that, I'd never been around those people before, and it completely opened my perceptions of what was possible, like what kind of person mattered, what people could create from nothing. It was a life-changing experience getting involved in the punk scene.
So the Ramones opened your mind to all these possibilities and made you feel less alone in your own, what you would have judged wrong-minded thinking, perhaps.
Exactly.
And then so you go to Chicago, and then you see...
I see it in practice.
Like things that you could never conceive of.
Exactly.
And just sort of like, of course there's room for this.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you see a dude wearing a trench coat completely covered in mouse traps.
Yeah.
And you think, well... that actually looks really cool, or
as opposed to what the fuck's wrong with that guy?
Yeah. Or, you go to a show and the singer from the band has a rat.
Yeah.
That is literally running around on his body while he's performing.
Who is that guy?
I think the band was called CHA, Chicago Housing Authority. And who would do that? Number one. And then when you see it in action, you think, well, why not? That's kind of,
cool,
it's like it's kind of a gross version of Alice Cooper and his Python,
Sure.
It's like,
well, that's interesting that like when you see that kind of stuff happening and you realize there are precedents for it in a way.
Right. But significantly, it's like, at the time there were these paradigms, there was disco music and rock music, and the rock stars were these exalted, like sort of statuesque dudes, and everything about them was mythical and phony, and everything about it was giant and overblown. And then like the disco scene, just all of it seemed manufactured and phony. It seemed like it was a perversion of a genuine culture. Like the soul music and the gay culture seemed genuine to me.
Right.
And disco was just like fucking Guidos, it was just like, douchebags. And it was, when you'd see like the sort of mustache schmucks with their silk shirts, like it's easy to be offended by that culturally.
Right. Sure.
Right. Without being offended by the gay and soul music roots of disco.
Right.
Disco was an aberration and was abhorrent.
Now, is this something that you've been able to forgive as you get older, or does that remain?
I have friends who identified with the social underclasses that were the antecedents of disco, and some of those people have like sort of embraced the more flamboyant diva aspects of disco, and I find their embrace of it charming.
So
that music is still repellent to me.
Sort of making it campy.
I don't think it's camp. I think it's genuine. Like it's sort of like the house music scene in Chicago.
Yeah.
And, like the house music scene in Chicago was a genuine expression of underclass and sort of not just minority, but like people of different sexual identities that was a genuine expression of joy for them, right? And then it was stylized and co-opted and turned into a formula, and it's easy to hate that formula.
Right.
And it's easy to hate that exploitation. But its initial expression in the clubs and in the garages in Chicago, I mean, that's legit.
It's beautiful.
You know, it has its own,
Sure.
it has its own soul.
So when you put Big Black together, so Naked Ray Gun was still playing. You were playing alongside of these bands that you looked up to.
Yeah.
And you became sort of a force in yourself. And where were you recording the original Big Black records when you started recording music?
I started recording on borrowed or rented equipment in my apartment. And then it wasn't until the second Big Black record that I actually recorded my band in the studio. I had been in the studio with other bands, sort of helping them record stuff.
But how'd you get the knack for that? I mean, when you say helping, what were your original tasks?
Well, when you're in a band,
yeah,
eventually your band wants to make a demo or some sort of recording of yourself, right?
Right.
And so it falls on somebody in the band to learn how to do that.
Yeah.
And I just learned, I volunteered. So I rented equipment. When I was back in Montana, I would go to the guitar shop and rent a tape recorder and rent some microphones.
Like an 8-track?
A 4-track.
4-track,
and, you know, figure out how to set it up and then do some recordings. And at the end of it, you end up with a recording of some kind.
Yeah.
You know? So I did that a few times, and then did the same thing when I moved to Chicago. Like I would do demo recordings for my friends' bands or my band, and then once you develop those skills, you become an asset to your peer group. And like, oh, he's that guy. He's done demo tapes for bands. You can get him to do your demo tape. And then, so then, when you're in a band, all your friends are in bands, and you end up doing this for everybody that you know until over time it just evolves and eventually it becomes a profession. You know? Like I occasionally speak at recording schools and the audio departments of universities and stuff, and people talk about their sort of like their career path.
Yeah.
And if I chart like from when I first started doing these experimental recordings with my own band, as the beginning of my experience in recording in the studio and stuff, in like 1978 or something, or so. Then I carried on doing that informally, certainly never getting paid, you know, for quite a long time. And then I eventually developed a relationship with some recording studios that let me bring bands in to record them on a semi-professional basis. And then eventually I had enough work where I could actually quit my job.
Right.
And that didn't happen for almost 10 years.
From 78 till 88, late 80s.
Yeah, 87, I think, is when I quit my job for the last time.
What was your job?
I was a photograph retouch artist at a place that did advertising imagery.
Where'd you pick up that skill?
I had been into photography when I was in high school, and then when I graduated at Northwestern, I needed a job, and that I just bullshitted my way into it and then learned it on the fly.
So you were a darkroom guy?
Yeah,
in high school.
Yeah,
me too.
I was into
black and white, right?
Photography, mostly, yeah. And then, then I was working for this company that did images for the advertising industry.
Sure.
And so a lot of my time was spent, you know, working on like the Marlboro Man or the Merit cigarette campaign or, you know, Salem.
Just getting the color right or
stuff like there'd be a dude they'd photograph in the studio and then him leaning against a motorcycle.
Right.
And then they'd have this like epic mountain vista. You know, like, all right, take the motorcycle dude, put him there.
Yeah.
And then, so at the end of this little wooden cigarette that he's holding as a prop, you have to put the fire on the cigarette, you know, that kind of stuff. Like really, really mundane, really, but somebody has to do it, you know.
And it was good money?
Yeah, terrific money.
Yeah.
And so when I quit, I had tried to get my ducks in a row before I quit. Like I bought a house, I qualified for my mortgage, and then I quit. Yeah, so like it wasn't a matter of me trying to buy a house as a self-employed.
You still live in that house?
No, I had to sell that house when I built the studio that I work in now. But I went from being a college student to being a professional in that business to being self-employed as a recording engineer. And I was doing recordings the whole time. But I think the expectation now is that at the end of a university program, you're qualified to work in an industry, and then you can just get a job in that industry. And that, specifically in recording, there's just so much stuff that you pick up in the saddle that I don't think that's a realistic and besides, there's just no jobs. Like, no one is hiring recording engineers. You know?
So you basically give lectures to tell the class that it's like, look, it's really a long shot, and what you're doing here is probably bullshit.
Well, the main thing is that if you're interested in it, you will pursue it anyway.
Right.
And
anything.
And then you will find a way to make it part of your life.
But it's interesting to me that your primary momentum was to be a musician.
Yeah, I mean, the job was definitely a means to an end of me playing music and being involved in
that was your
scene.
first passion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The way I describe it is that there are some people who want a career in music. That is, they want to be able to play music and have music pay their rent for them.
Right.
And then there are people, and I would consider myself one of these people, who I'm willing to work a 40-hour-a-week job in order to support my interest in music. The way some people would support a family, I support my interest in music. And
that's playing, recording, whatever it may be.
Yeah, whatever it is. And as a fan, especially in the punk rock scene where there weren't that many people and everybody had to do a lot of things, if you're one thing, you're also another. Like, if you're in a band, you're also a contact for out-of-town bands booking gigs.
Right.
If you're a contact for that, well, then you also have to handle printing up posters or flyers for the gig.
Right.
And then once you're doing that, well, that's a small step from there to making record jackets and pressing up records and being a record label.
Yeah.
And once you're doing that, then it's a small step, from there to distributing your friends' records as well. And so basically everybody involved in music, like, evolved
in the original punk rock community.
In the punk scene, had fingers in all of those areas. Like, everybody that you run into that was in a band, they would also, the guys in Naked Ray Gun owned a PA that they used, a public address system they used for their practice room.
Yeah.
They would also rent it out for gigs and go do gigs as a sound company.
Right.
And then a bunch of the bands got together and they're like, we're all pressing up our records and we're trying to sell them. Let's call ourselves a label, put all of our records under the same label, and then maybe we'll have more clout. And so we formed a collective record label. That was a record label, really, only in that they all used the same P.O. box.
Right.
Every band was operating independently.
What label was that?
It's called Ruthless Records.
Oh, yeah.
And that record label, we put records out by basically all of our peers in Chicago. If they wanted to put a record out under the name Ruthless Records, they were welcome to.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And as long as they did all the work, no problem, But what it allowed you to do is, like, you could call a distributor and say, hey, I've got these new, there's a new Naked Ray Gun record coming out next week, but you still owe us for these Big Black records or these Effigies records that you bought, and you haven't paid that invoice, and we're not going to ship you any of the Naked Ray Gun records unless you pay those invoices. Now, the guy on the other end of the phone didn't know that Naked Ray Gun would send him the records regardless, right? But I could still say that, and I could still get paid.
You were the guy that did that.
Sure.
You were the heavy.
Well, I was the least likely to get paid. Let's put it that way.
So you're telling me that, like, by the time you recorded Surfer Rosa, the Pixies record, you hadn't quite quit your day job yet?
No, I was still working for a photo lab in Chicago. Yeah.
And at that point, you were getting a reputation?
I don't think so. It may look that way if you're looking, in reverse chronologically, right?
Yeah.
But at the time, I was essentially unknown outside of the very small circle of people who were into making records.
But the Pixies were out of Boston, right?
Yeah.
So how did they find you?
Their record label was in England. There was another Boston band called the Throwing Muses.
I remember them.
It got signed to an English record label called 4AD.
Right.
And the Throwing Muses people were friends with the Pixies people. And they said to their record label, here's this cassette from this other Boston band you might be interested in. They got signed on the basis of that cassette before they'd really established themselves as a performing band. Mm-hmm. I don't know how many shows they'd done at that point, but they weren't a known quantity.
Right.
And then their first record came out. It was an EP that was culled from that cassette. It did some business and established them somewhat. And when they were fixing to do an album, their English record label sort of essentially sent my name down from above and said, you should talk to Steve Albini about doing your record. I don't think they had ever heard of me. I don't think they knew who I was,
Sure.
Which I wouldn't have taken that as an insult at the time. I would have been completely normal. Right. So then I contacted them. I heard their cassette. I thought they were an interesting band. I thought I could probably work on the record and do okay. They were one of the first bands that I worked on where they weren't part of my immediate peer group. You know.
And were you impressed with the music?
Yeah, to an extent. I think that guy Charles, I think, is a distinctive songwriter. I thought he had some odd ideas that I thought were underrepresented. You know? And I to this day I have a very close relationship with Kim Deal. I think she's got an absolutely magical voice. I think she is a genius, and she thinks about music in a unique way. I consider myself very close to her in terms of her musical existence. Like I really admire her, and I'm proud of that association. The Pixies as a band, you know, they were fine. Whatever, they were fine. I'm not, you know, I thought as a band their music was kind of unremarkable. Like, especially considering what we were talking about, like the extraordinary range of experiences that you could have in the punk scene at the time. I felt like their music was like fairly conservative.
Well, but that record turns out to be a great record. So did you find in starting out that dealing with maybe something you couldn't say directly to their face, which is like, you guys are okay, that made you sort of compensate?
Well, I should point out that I was still pretty green.
No, I know, but I'm just saying, like, but is there part of you that said, I'm gonna pop this shit?
No, not at all. Like, even then, I didn't think that I had, I didn't think I was able to you know, make something into, you can't turn a sausage into a trout. You know,
no.
I didn't have that kind of a delusion. I think I did insinuate myself into the personality of the record a little much to my way of thinking.
Into that record?
Yeah. Like the little bits of recorded conversation that ended up on that record, and like certain sonic aspects of it, I think were driven more by my ambition than the band's organic. And that actually left a bad taste in my mouth, thinking that, you know, for the rest of their career, this band has to answer for all these little gags that are on their record that weren't their idea. But now they have to go to their grave with that as hung on them as part of their legacy, right?
Well, I'm sure that somebody made it their idea.
Well,
do they always say like, "No, that was Albini"?
Well, regardless, I would know,
right?
You know that I did that to them rather than them coming up with it, and so that helped to shape my current philosophy, which has been sort of since then. I tend not to insinuate myself too much into the personality of the record. I tend not to try to exert very much control over the music I'm recording. And I would go as far as to say that I try to avoid forming opinions about the music that I work on as an engineer, because I think it's inappropriate. I think one of the experiences that I had with my friends' bands going into the studio during the punk era was my friend's band would come into the studio and he would set up his amplifier and he would be playing, and it would sound awesome. It would sound like that's what my friend sounds like when he plays his guitar, right? And then you'd see the engineer through the glass in the control room, and he would like be sort of crinkling his nose a little, and it would come out, and you know, you would see this sort of pantomime of a conversation between the guitar player and the engineer, and it would conclude with the engineer reaching over and turning the amplifier down to satisfy himself, like, you know, you shouldn't play so loud. And then you would hear this guy that you were familiar with and his music. He would play his guitar, and it wouldn't sound like him anymore. It would sound feeble. But the engineer would now have a smile on his face, like, I fixed it. Right? So I've seen that mentality of the engineer trying to, like, use his tastes and his perception of the music. I've seen that be detrimental. If the band is really into something and they're doing something, they have a method that they've used to form the personality of the band. I don't want to interfere with that. And it's also, I mean, on one hand, it's none of my business, because that's all internal stuff that goes on within the band, like what their aesthetic is, how they want to present their music. And on the other hand, like, my tastes are pretty fucked up. Like, the music that I listen to is kind of absurd. Like, I like a lot of stuff that sounds like kind of a disaster.
Like what?
Well, we'd mentioned this band, End Result. They were a band from Chicago. Like, they were, an aggressively experimental, noisy, outsider band. Very much outside, not just the mainstream music scene, but outside even the punk scene and the hardcore scene that was developing at the time. Truly odd, genuinely weird, beautiful music. Right? If you but most people listening to it would just assess it as like noise and screaming. But for me, I have an emotional resonance with it, and I think it's beautiful, right?
Yeah.
So if I tried to make other bands that are trying to make a conventionally pretty record, if I tried to make them sound more like End Result, it would be a failure on both counts. Like,
sure.
It's like if you see a beautiful woman and she's wearing a pink frock and has lipstick on, and then you see a grizzly bear. And you think, well, I wonder, maybe I should put lipstick on and a dress on that bear. I mean, all you're going to do is piss off the bear.
Right. Yeah.
And in the end, it's not going to be any more beautiful. The bear.
I get it. Yeah.
So that's like I try to.
That's how you gauge not interfering.
Yeah, I try to let each band have the experience of making the record that they want, and also I try not to. I've seen engineers I've seen it happen where someone is trying to improve things and they diminish them, and I don't want to do that. I would rather have them be, erratic and unpredictable and or like not classically perfect in order for them to be more genuine.
So do you think, though, as time went on, I mean, you did several bands, several records, Boss Hog, The Breeders, Jesus Wizard, you did a lot of, people come back to you.
Sure.
Do you think your reputation in the music community was that let's go to Albini because he's going to honor our exact sound, or Albini's going to Albini it?
Well, I think I flatter myself in thinking that I do a good job, right? And I think that that's a baseline that a lot of people have been frustrated by. Like a lot of bands just felt like they were treated ineptly in the studio previously. So just if you listen to a record from a band that you're familiar with and you think, wow, that sounds convincingly like that band, and then you look in the credits and it's me that did the recording, that's very gratifying for me.
Sure.
And also that might entice you to bring your band to me, right? So I like to think that that's a part of it. Like on a basic level, I do a good job. Secondary to that, I'm also a bargain. Like for people in my position who do what I do, I charge significantly less than most of the people who are, that have that kind of CV and have that kind of tenure, and people have been doing it for as long and have the kind of facility available.
Right.
So it's a bargain. Right. So that's another selling point.
But you like John Spencer did a few records with you.
Yeah.
And they've got
we're good friends.
Yeah. I love those guys. And did you do their last album?
No, I've worked on bits and pieces over the years. I've rarely worked on an entire record start to finish with John because he's a pretty creative guy, and he has a lot of he had a lot of procedural ideas about how he wants to do things. And a lot of it is stuff that he just wants to pursue on his own, and I have a lot of respect for that.
But there's a lot of punch to it. You know what I mean?
I mean, and you can tell when you're listening to music from somebody who's really single-minded, like somebody who's kind of gripped by a mania of something, right?
Yeah.
And that, to me, that trumps anything else. Like you can listen to a recording that, from a classical standpoint, is a bad recording. It's distorted. It's just not full frequency response. It's not an accurate reflection of what was going on. Blah blah blah. But you can feel the mania coming through it, right? And that, to me, trumps everything else.
Right. You need to feel that. Yeah. Well, because in my limited sort of understanding of what in my mind you represented, production wise, was that there was, whether it was with Nevermind or maybe you did a Wedding Present record, didn't you?
Yeah, I did a couple of records for them.
That there was this sort of wall of sort of the guitars were, up front, but that's me just reading into you.
Well, and what you're picking up on is the aesthetic of the band. Like a lot of those bands had that as an aesthetic. Like they wanted to have a very sort of overwhelming sound presentation.
But is that what you do? I mean, isn't like Big Black sort of like that as well?
Yeah, I mean, our aesthetic was pretty raging, but then I've also worked on a lot of very modest music. Like there's a band called Low who are
I like that. I like them.
Very beautiful. Yeah. Very very. You could say modest, but I think it's also quite intense.
Yeah.
And I think that that presentation is as difficult and as much of a challenge or as much of an interest of mine as an engineer as doing like a ripping rock record is. I've done a bunch of records with a singer-songwriter from New York named Nina Anastasia. And she's done some records where it's just her singing and playing a guitar, and some records where it's her and as many as 9 or 12 people playing in a very large ensemble. And there's a thread of continuity.
Right.
Her aesthetic it survives through all those different changes, and each of those settings requires different things from an engineer. But I find that very gratifying to work on as well. Like I don't think that I have a single aesthetic that I want to apply to other bands. What I like to think is that I'm sensitive to what they're trying to do, and I have enough of a technical experience that I can pull off what they're trying to get at.
And also an appreciation of music.
Yeah, I think that's less important, though. I mean, what we were talking about before, I'm trying not to form an opinion about the music.
I get that. But in talking about you as a person, and I'm not arguing with you, that the same spirit that brought you to Chicago to appreciate all these different elements, you know, it's within you. I mean, there's part of you, if it's not Gordon Lightfoot, which you can even contextualize, you can say, like, I see this.
Right. And like I said, I mean, as I've matured, if Gordo called me, I would probably say yes. But like the point being that I feel like, I wouldn't have stuck with music if music wasn't important to me. I probably would have done something else that had a technical capacity. Like I could conceivably have satisfied myself as a photograph retouch artist for the rest of an extended career.
Do you still take pictures, or did you take pictures?
It's been a long time.
Yeah.
Haven't really.
But like, I guess sort of, maybe it's just my personal, what I'm bringing to it, because I look at, the number of albums you've produced, which is hundreds, right? Thousands, maybe?
Thousands.
Yeah. Of all different levels.
Yeah.
Like, they're ones that I know, and I know where the artist was before they recorded with you and where they were after, like someone like Nirvana or like PJ Harvey, and now like in looking at the John Spencer stuff and the Breeder stuff, like, and like for me, like, if I listen to the difference between, you didn't do Dry, did you? The PJ Harvey one?
Yeah.
You did that one?
No, I didn't do Dry, I did Rid of Me.
Right, so. Like the difference between Dry and Rid of Me is profound. So in my mind, I'm like, well, Steve must have done that.
Well, but then if you listen to the other records, other PJ Harvey records, like there's a pretty dramatic personality shift between every record. Like,
I see that now.
At the point that I did the PJ Harvey record, PJ Harvey was a band, a functioning three-piece band.
Right.
The name of the band was PJ Harvey.
Right.
Right. Shortly thereafter, PJ Harvey became a solo performer, Polly Harvey.
Right.
And the band identity didn't exist anymore. So she made radical changes between each of her records as an individual. I worked on the last record that she did where it was the original incarnation of a band.
Right.
And then she broke away from that and became a solo performer after that. And
right.
So her solo records were all constructed sort of individually.
Right.
I think I am sensitive about getting credit for aesthetic decisions that the bands and the musicians make.
Well, I think that's
because I am aggressive about not participating in those decisions. But,
right.
So if you listen to a record and you think, wow, that was really brilliant the way they did that with the music there, that's not me.
Yeah.
That's them.
Right. Well, I think that takes some humility, huh?
Well, I mean, it's part of it is there's a careerist aspect to being an engineer or a producer where in the mainstream paradigm of record labels in the music business, people use their professional capital in different ways. But first you have to accrue that capital. You have to become responsible for a hit or a success or something, right? So you have to claim authorship of it somehow. And then you have some professional capital which you can then use to extend your career, right? I've never been interested in a career in that sense. I like my job. I want to keep doing it, And this is why you notoriously don't sign on for the royalties. Yeah, I don't take royalties on records that I work on, partly because I think it's part of a system that exploits the musicians and artists in a way that I'm just not comfortable with. Right. But also, I just don't feel like my job warrants it. There's a fundamental thing that I've noticed about the music scene, which is that whenever anyone wants to be paid a percentage for whatever it is, it doesn't matter whether it's management, booking agent, promoter, or whatever. Whenever somebody wants to be paid a percentage of what would otherwise be your income, that person is being overpaid. Yeah, right. No, I understand that. And I feel like not participating in that system makes it easier for me to get to sleep, and also means that the differential, like the money that would otherwise have gone to me, that's going to the band. And I feel good about that. Yeah. I feel good about knowing that the members of Nirvana, for example, are a couple $1 million richer as individuals. It's their music. It's their record. they deserve that money. They made those records, and they lived that experience, right?
Right.
So they deserve that couple extra $1 million that I didn't get, right?
Right.
And it's not like I'm hurting,
Right.
It's like I can still make rent, I just keep doing my job and I keep getting paid,
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's the strength of character that you've decided for yourself, and it's commendable in a way.
I mean, I appreciate that, and that's a very nice thing to say to me and about me, but I also feel like it's just an observation, like other people haven't realized that they're exploiting other people.
Right.
Other people, and it's very easy to.
We chose not to play along with the paradigm that was feeding everybody.
Yeah, but it's easy to either feign ignorance or prefer ignorance in a situation like that, where you know.
But another producer might, just as easily as you say that it's the band's record, would say like, well, I produced that record. I'm part of it.
Okay. Yeah.
Right?
I mean, okay. I mean, if the producer, if he was that important, or if he was that big of a factor.
What do you think George Martin would say? Like, I don't deserve any of that Beatles money.
Now, bear in mind, George Martin came from a completely different political organization of the music scene. In the late 50s, early 60s, there was a hierarchy within the corporate structure of a record label, where a producer was a staff person who was responsible for making records, and he picked the artists, picked the songs, picked the studios, made the arrangements, blah, blah, blah. So completely different paradigm.
Okay.
Right. So, and in that paradigm, that compensation scheme probably made sense because he was much more of an authority.
And he's in the system.
And he's in the system.
Yeah.
Like,
I get it.
Not part of that.
Right.
But if you talk about contemporary producers, like people who make music now, there are a couple of different kinds. The term has evolved in meaning. Like, there are people who make completely finished backing tracks, and then they can apply a vocalist over any portion of that track and to finish it, to complete it. And in that sense, those people are authors of that music.
Right.
Right. But when a band comes in with a song that they wrote 4 years ago that they've been playing on the road, and that they, is like an embodiment of their aesthetic, and they knock that song out in 2 takes, and I just sit in the chair and hit record, there's no way that I deserve more than just an hourly wage, basically, for what I've done, and that's the situation that I'm in most commonly. I'm recording what a band is doing organically,
and you're making it sound the best you can.
Yeah, and that's just boils down to competence.
You call yourself a recording engineer.
Sure.
Yeah, over a producer.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen producers in action, and they're like bossing people around and telling people to, keep the hi-hat a little more peppery off the top, shit like that.
It's not something you say.
No, of course not. So, like, that sort of stuff, if you're doing that, then I'm proud not to be associated with that.
Now, what are the biggest records that you were involved in your mind? Like, I know that In Utero, that was the one that you got. That was the last one. And they came to you.
Yeah. When you say biggest records, I presume that you're talking about like their financial.
No, not necessarily.
Turnaround,
this is what you think. That example's big, but that was a big change for them, and it's a significant record for them.
Okay, I'll give you 2 records that are really big for me. Mm-hmm. I did a record. It's a couple of years ago now. For a guy named John Grabsky. Mm-hmm. He had been given a terminal cancer diagnosis. Mm-hmm. After having beaten cancer previously.
Right.
The cancer reasserted itself, and he had a terminal diagnosis.
Right.
He had 2 options in his treatment. He could maintain a sort of normal quality of life for a relatively short period, or he could maybe extend his life by being very aggressive with the treatment.
Right.
At the expense of much lessened quality of life.
Yeah.
And he chose to live his life as normally as he could and let the cancer take its course, but he was going to try to be productive in the months that he had left, or months or weeks, whatever it ended up being. And he contacted me and said he wanted to make an album documenting his relationship with the disease, and that's how he wanted to spend his last months on Earth, was making this record that was going to be a statement about his relationship to the disease. So he and his brother came to the studio, and we recorded an album, and we finished it, and it got mixed, and it got released. And the album is out under the name of the band is Teeth, and the album is called The Strain. And it's an incredible record. It's a great record. It's a brutal record, and it's a really eyes-open assessment of his, they call it a struggle. It's not a struggle. It's a relationship. It's his relationship with the disease from the inside, right? And it's like it's a kind of like a war correspondent giving the rest of the world a synopsis of the action, along with him just expressing himself about his emotional state and his feelings and his fear and his, everything tied into it. It's a really remarkable album. So that record's really big for me. The fact that I was able to do that record with that guy in the last months of his life, and his approach to life and his commitment to staying on it rather than being passive, or rather than making accommodations to the disease, that was inspirational to me. Again, it was one of those things like listening to that Ramones record. It changed the way I saw the whole world and the range of possibilities that I could have. So that's a big record for me. A few years earlier, Kim Deal had been contacting me about making a Breeders record, or a record under the name of the Breeders. She'd gone through a bunch of personal stuff. She had her band, her actual band, the Breeders, had kind of dissolved under her. She tried to mount another version of that band, and that was a failure. She had burned through a whole bunch of money. Yeah. It was kind of at the end of her rope with respect to that relationship. And we got started making this record, and she was suspicious of me, as she had grown to become suspicious of other recording engineers who had been trying to sort of hoodwink her into doing things in ways that she didn't want to. And that reopened our relationship. We hadn't really interacted much since the first Breeders record that I worked on.
Which one?
It was called Pod.
Yeah, that's a good record. And then, that's the one with the cover of
Happiness is a Warm Gun.
Yeah.
So, and in the intervening years, she had seen, a lot of changes in her personal life.
Yeah.
She'd,
battling this and that. Yeah.
Yeah. Gone through a bunch of shit.
Yeah.
Right. If that session had gone poorly, like if she hadn't been able to reanimate the Breeders at that point, I shudder to think what other things might have gone wrong for her. But we had a very successful session. We carried on with more. She formed a new version of the band around the success of those initial sessions. We recorded some with that band. She carried on. And since then, she's made several Breeders albums, some of which I haven't worked on.
Which record was that?
This was a record called Title TK. And that record reinvigorated my reestablished my relationship with Kim. She's become a dear friend. I have an enormous amount of respect for her and her aesthetic and her perseverance through all the bullshit that she's been saddled with. And so that record stands out to me as an important record. And then, so those are two specific records, but they kind of hint at a thing where I've worked with some people over a very long period of time, and many sessions with these people, and they've become kind of woven into the fabric. We've each sort of gotten woven into the fabric of our lives, and those relationships to me mean more than the records, which are just little artifacts along the way of a relationship. Right. So, so what I'm most proud of are those relationships, those long-standing relationships where it's not just that I'm working with somebody again and again. It's that, the whole range of experiences that was hinted at to me by the idea of punk rock as expressed by the Ramones, whatever, all of that is all true. Like I get to experience all of these life experiences. I get to have these long, meaningful friendships and professional relationships that transcend any artifact that you make along the way. Those are the things that matter to me.
That's beautiful.
Oh.
Yeah, but I mean, it wasn't always like that, was it? I mean, that's something that sort of evolved as you evolved as a person.
Yeah, I mean,
emotionally.
It probably took me 20 years to be ready to realize that the actual records aren't that important, you know, and I genuinely feel like the actual records are not that important. Like, it's nice when there's a good record, and I'm proud of doing a good job and all that sort of stuff. But the records are signposts along, you know,
your life and the life of others.
And I'm pleased that I have gotten to experience all the things that I've gotten to experience along the way.
And like it, you know, we talked about, you know, early on, like, because it struck me that in looking back at who I thought you were, that there was, you know, an intensity and an anger and it's sort of like a person that was sort of, you know, just ready to explode. And
well, I mean, I should point out that I've managed to steer clear of all of the things that I might otherwise have been frustrated by and angered at. You know, like the conventions of the mainstream music business. Like, I just don't operate that way, so I'm never frustrated by it. Like,
and booze and drugs was never your thing?
No, I mean, I stopped drinking in my 20s. I just realized I didn't like being drunk. I didn't like, and I was a dick to other people when I would drink, and it wasn't like I gave anything up.
Right.
A lot of people that I know have, like, I'm very lucky that I never developed a taste for alcohol because I was a real prick, you know.
And you saw, I mean, I have to assume that over the arc of this career and talking about some of your close friends, that this was not, you saw it. You saw the ravages, and you saw it in every manifestation, I imagine.
And it, you know, I've seen people who have lost things more important to them for the sake of indulging, you know,
the addiction,
a chemical, which is tragic. But I also have seen people for whom an identity as an addict or an identity as a drunk or whatever, that is a part of their personality that they cherish. Like, they feel like, you know, being in that spectrum is part of what defines them. And they feel like if they lose that, then they're losing something important about the way they see the world or the way they interact with it. And I'm not going to judge that as wrong. You know?
Right. Well, you seem like reasonably happy.
Yeah. I think, like I said, I've tended to avoid those things that could frustrate me.
You have kids?
I have no kids. None that I know of, anyway.
And I know that you play professional poker a bit.
Yeah, I would consider myself semi-professional. I can't. I mean, if I tried to make a living as a poker player, it would probably be a pretty meager living.
And was it? But it was just something you were interested in and you enjoyed doing.
I've played cards my whole life. It's a tremendously stimulating game. I enjoy I'm not a competitive person by nature. Like, you know, I don't necessarily want to beat anybody else. I want to do things well. I want to do something well myself.
Right.
So I'm not as concerned about beating somebody else as I am about, you know, doing things correctly or doing things well myself. And poker is a place where you have, you know, there's pretty obvious scoreboard. You know, like, it's like if you leave with more money than you came with, well, then you're doing something right.
I know you sort of have a kind of a proletariat sort of view of your job, but are there people that you want to work with that you haven't?
Oh, sure. I mean,
like, is there someone out there you're like, I love to record that?
I get asked this question a lot, and I've had the same. The same laundry list. The same. Well, my point being, if any of this was ever going to happen, it would have by now, probably. You know, like, I couldn't count the number of times that I've said, you know, Neil Young, give me a call. You know?
Right.
You know? But Willie Nelson, you know, I mean, hit Google. I'm very easy to find. You know?
and affordable.
Yeah. But you know, I did get the experience of recording the Stooges, who were, you know.
Oh, you did the weirdness, right?
Yeah, I did an album with them, and that was an experience that I wouldn't trade for the world. Like, just hanging out with the Stooges for a month was maybe the coolest thing I've ever done. I can't claim to be that cool of a person.
Right.
But hanging out with the Stooges every day, like just hearing Iggy's voice over the intercom, when you ring the doorbell, like, yeah, it's Iggy. It's like fucking, it's the best, You just, like, if I could time travel back to 15-year-old me and say, don't worry about all this bullshit. One of these days you're going to get to record the Stooges album. It's going to be great, And it was exactly the experience you would want. Like Iggy was like huge personality. He had his shirt off the whole time.
He had his shirt off in here.
Yeah. He's wrought iron, that guy. That's exactly what he is. What you think Iggy Pop is, what you think the kind of a dude you would like to, like, if I ran into Iggy Pop, what would it be like? That's what it's like.
Yeah, it's better than you think. Like, I was surprised at how articulate and how good his memory is and how intelligent he is and how he's framed his life. It's amazing.
And, and the other guys, and seeing, particularly for Ron and Scott, like, they're both gone now, but they had always been kind of shortchanged. Like it was their band, and they never really achieved any kind of like significant success during the initial iteration of that band. Like they were known by other musicians, but like they weren't celebrated, right? And to see their band like sort of reanimated like that in its original incarnation, like this is the band that we always wanted, and we've got it back. And we're playing to sellouts every night, and people love us. Like that was very satisfying for them to see, like, their ambition for themselves, like see it realized like that, in a very tangible way.
After so many years.
Yeah, after so long, to get another bite at the apple was I thought that was really, really great.
You brought up Bill Hicks. Did you know Bill?
I didn't know him. My wife knew him quite well. My wife.
Oh, really?
Yeah, my wife has worked in the comedy world for quite a long time.
Do I know her?
Heather Winna. She managed, I want to say, the Funny Firm in Chicago and the Laugh Factory in Chicago. For the last 12, 15 years, she's been a manager at the Second City. And so she knows all the comics that used to come through and all those places where she worked. And, and so I have interacted with a lot of those people, but I didn't know Bill.
But he had an influence. He seems like, in terms of your spirit, that there's definitely a similarity in. Yeah,
I mean, all the stories that there was a guy that used to work at our studio. There's a guy named John Novotny. He was a stand-up in Chicago, and he and Bill were friends. And like the stories that I've heard from Heather and from John about Bill, I appreciate how genuine he was. Like he's another one of those guys. Like, you see his comedy and you get a sense of his perspective, and you wonder what he would be like as a person. And then it's nice to hear from people that knew him directly that he was basically the same dude.
Same dude, a little sweeter.
Yeah.
Like, in one-on-one. So what's your relationship with comedy? Was that part of it? Like, I know that you thought the Ramones were funny, but when you were a kid, was comedy sort of a thing?
I can't really say that I was that embedded in the comedy culture.
Right.
Like I know there was a period where comedy was like sort of in its heyday in the late 80s, early 90s, where there was like the stand-up thing was
the boom.
A route to some sort of stardom.
Yeah.
I didn't really participate in it, or I didn't know anybody that did, but in the ensuing years, through Heather and her friends, I've come to meet a lot of people who ended up being kind of significant comics. There's a guy who used to work he was in a band, and he used to work in the clubs in Chicago, named Fred Armisen, who's...
I know Fred, yeah.
Terrific dude. And he honed his comic skills by, like, mocking and playing with all the people in the he used to work at a club called Lounge Acts, which is a club where all the bands would tour through, and he would like play pranks on the bands, and he would that's where a lot of his comic sensibility came from,
right?
And
he's a musician himself.
He was a drummer in a band called Trenchmouth, and so seeing him go from being just like Fred from Lounge Acts to being this like international star, television star, like that's one of the most amazing things that I've ever witnessed up close. It's like he's the first person that I've ever known that wanted to become famous, and then like through strength of will and being funny made himself famous.
It's pretty astounding, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you're in town playing?
We played a couple of nights. We played at the Echo, and we played at the Regent Theater last night, and now my wife and I are just taking a day off to goof off.
Well, it was a real honor talking to you, buddy.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for coming.
No problem.
There you go. The man, the force of nature, That is Steve Albini. I hope that satisfied most of your needs out of a conversation with Mr. Albini. Just a reminder, Chipotle is a sponsor of today's show. That is the truth. You don't always get the truth when you go out to eat. You know that, right? If you order something, that's what you should get. You shouldn't get the thing you ordered plus a whole bunch of mystery ingredients. At Chipotle, it's chicken, beef, pork, tofu, beans, rice, cheese, veggies, and that's it, folks. Wrap it all up in a tortilla or do the bowl thing if you want. Chipotle, food without a side of questions. Hey, and also, if you could do me a favor, if you have an extra minute, please go to WTFsurvey.com to take a very short, anonymous survey about today's episode. It would be a big help to the show, and I'd appreciate it. Okay? Again, that's WTFsurvey.com. Also go to WTF Pod for all your WTF Pod needs. Not touring much because I'm working on a thing that I can't talk about yet. What's that noise? You want guitar? I made up a riff that I like, and I think I will play it for you now. Boomer lives!